GM Growth Fam, time for another episode of Let's Grow Together. Now, today I want to talk about why is it that most crypto brands look, feel, talk the exact same way. I mean, if you really think about it, and this especially happens at the earlier stages, founders and teams don't really put a lot of thought and effort into creatively setting themselves apart. And quite honestly, the definition of branding is so broken and has been perceived in so many different ways that most teams don't pay a lot of time and attention to it. And interestingly, the teams that actually do that, think Mega ETH, think Verochain, think Celestia for that matter. I think they've done a brilliant job with that as well. They're able to set themselves apart and are able to deliver on pretty much all of the KPIs that a successful project needs to deliver on, just based on the fact, or let's say largely based on the fact that they have a brilliant brand. So I want to give you a few tips on how is it, first of all, that you should look at branding. What are certain sort of structural frameworks that you can keep in mind to make sure that the brand you build is going to be a brand that lasts, that people want to support, and that people want to advocate for? So, kicking it off, the first thing I want to talk about is content contextualization. So, when you think about content, you are thinking about either written content or visual content. Within written content, I'm not just talking about Twitter, I am talking about any place, anywhere that you are going to use text that needs to represent your brand. So, that includes your website, that includes your blog, that in fact also includes your community members within your Telegram and Discord chats talking and interacting with your community in a certain way. That is going to build resonance, that's going to build a larger sense of community and almost give you a certain sphere of your own that you can interact with. So, within written content, here are a few tips that you need to keep in mind. So, the first thing to keep in mind is your content needs to be compelling. It's easier said than done. But what I mean by compelling, if it's bland, if it feels dry, if it's we are the next revolutionary, blah, 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 you've already lost me. However, now think about two pieces of content. One is we're revolutionizing the next phase of financial and wealth management, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. To a certain audience, it might even seem appealing. But if 10 other brands are going to talk in that exact same way, I'm not really that interested. However, now if you changed it to actually focus on the pain point, we're going to make your transfers to your friends and family abroad 10 times easier, 100 times cheaper, and 1,000 times faster. Now, what sounds more appealing? It's really interesting because, especially in technology and whenever we're on the frontier of tech, we seem to think that complicating things is the better thing to do, and that makes a brand more compelling. However, in most cases, that's not really true. The second thing I want you to keep in your mind is make your written content actionable. So when I read something, and this is especially true when I'm on Twitter, for example, or I'm on your website, for example, if the first thing I see on your website, for it, in this instance, is only you puffing up your chest and boasting about yourselves, I'm not interested. But if the first thing I see on your website is, hey, you've probably, and you're contextualizing your written content in a way that somebody that's coming on your website is ready to take some kind of action. And there are a million ways you can get it right and 10 million ways you can get it wrong. So the first thing to do is actually make sure that somebody who is landed on your website is ready to take action. And your written copy on your website needs to be structured in a way that compels an action out of a user. Like, hey, do you like cheap transactions? Do you like faster speeds? Do you like a easier experience? Well, you're at the right place. Come and, take an action. And this also goes beyond just the practical aspect of it. So, also, whenever somebody is reading copy, especially, people are very quick to formulate a frame around a brand. Now, framing is a very widely known concept. I'm not going to bore you with the definitions and so on and so forth. You can go and Google it. But the interesting thing over there is, because people are very quick to formulate an opinion, essentially a frame about your brand, there are generally two purposes that people will put you within. It'll either be perception based or it'll be utility based. Perception based is when you walk into, let's say, a Zara showroom, and this is more for the Indian audiences because I know Zara is not really a luxury-ish brand outside, but in India it is. So you're probably looking at apparels that are anywhere close to 5K to 10K, sometimes even more than that. And when you walk into an H&M or a Marks and Spencer showroom, it's a completely different experience. And the framing that I'm going to formulate in my mind is Zara is a luxury brand, H&M is not. It's a consumer brand. So my perception about H&M is that's a utility based. And I mean, it is a stretch, but let's, for the sake of argument, say that is a utility based brand. And my framing is going to be it's useful. Whereas with Zara, or I think a much better example in this case would be, let's say, a Burberry or a Tory Burch or Ralph Lauren, is probably going to be perceived as an aspirational brand. So that's a perception based framing that I've formulated about brand. So when it comes to tech, when it comes to crypto projects yourselves, you have to understand what framing you want to build in somebody's mind. If it's going to be utility based, well, amazing. Then make sure that you are hammering that with compelling copy that is actionable. If you're an aspirational brand, well, you still want to be compelling, but then your action is probably going to be broken up into multiple steps. So make sure that your written copy is walking somebody through the steps to reach their aspirations. I love the way how on newspapers these days you see a BMW or a Mercedes Benz ad, which are ludicrously expensive automobiles within the Indian market for, well, reasons unknown. But it's interesting because they're not really advertising the exact pricing of it. They're going to advertise either pre owned vehicles or an EMI, or let's say installment based pricing over there. Apple brands do this. Oh, sorry. Apple products do this within their Apple stores as well, where the more bigger pricing is actually the EMI, or the, the monthly costing of that, rather than the actual costing of the product itself. So again, it is, you can be an aspirational brand, but you can position yourselves as a utility based brand based on how you use written copy. Now the second thing is visuals. So it's easier said than done, but I really love the way, and this is a very old ad that I saw in some YouTube video, but it was actually the Volkswagen Beetle on a full page newspaper advertisement. And the Beetle was like this tiny, and there was a lot of blank space within the ad, which is in complete contrast to what I would generally be reading within newspaper and looking at advertisements, because generally they're filled with color, they're all flamboyant and so on and so forth. And it's interesting because that actually tells you, and the framing over there that they used with their visuals was essentially like building a contrast within the beetle and the blank space to make sure that people understand that sometimes small things can have large impacts. That was essentially the messaging that they were trying to deliver. So it's interesting when you sort of perceive the brand within the general context of a newspaper, uh, when you're reading a newspaper. And the same thing is true with Twitter. The same thing is true with your website. The same thing is true with your emails. If the way you use graphics is how 1,000 other brands are using graphics, well, you're probably going to be forgotten like 1,000 other brands. So the smart thing to do is, when you are using graphics, when you are building templates, when you're when you are building a visual language for your brand, that you make sure to understand the context within the user interaction with the visuals that you're trying to bring up to them. And again, I'm going back to, I'm going to talk a lot about Mega Eats because I've gotten really deep into like understanding the psychology behind the completely different visual language that they've taken with it. It's also interesting because Eats Denver, you saw a lot of brands using sort of Apple-ish examples to position their brand. So the Celestia did it with their mammoth mascot. It was a mammoth within a very old Apple computer, and the textual language of that was very Apple-ish, very 1980s, early 90s Apple-ish language. So it's an interesting example because you don't expect that. And the framing that somebody's going to build, or the association that somebody's going to build through those visuals, is going to be, okay, Celestia is probably the next Apple, and that's very purposefully juxtaposed, but it's an interesting way to look at normal tech brands, because tech is not supposed to be boring; it needs to be exciting, and saying you're revolutionary is not as impactful as showing somebody that you're revolutionary, and that a large part of that is going to come from how your visuals look and feel on the places that people are consuming them. I think Mythical Games is also a brilliant example of that, because if you go to their website, it visually feels very different. It feels like a gaming company, but there are 10 million other elements within their ecosystem. It just feels very different. Feels like a gaming company. It doesn't feel like a crypto company. And also the usage of animations and so on and so forth. It's very different. It's very unique. I love Mythical Games. Okay. And the other thing I want to talk about is the cultural and emotional resonance that you can build again with your branding. What do I mean by that? It's one thing to use memes and what's happening with the market within, your Twitter copy, or you're using it within graphics, so on and so forth. It's one thing to use them, and it's another thing to mold them. And what I mean by molding that is, a lot of people, especially when the market goes down, start to use the McDonald's job crypto bro meme, let's say. It's a very common example. A lot of brands start to use it. Now, how you use it uniquely and mold it to your own brand itself is where you're going to create resonance. So, being culturally aligned and being culturally resonative are two very different things. When you think about cultural resonance, you actually want to take cultural, topical events, news events, so on and so forth, and mold them within your own language. So, and this is especially interesting if you have a mascot, or if are creatively using your logo. So instead of just plainly and blandly using the McDonald's bro meme, you could mold it into the graphic actually including your brand logo in a very creative way. And now visually it feels very different. Mega Eats actually did that. Again, I'm gonna blabber about them a lot, but that was a great example of how you can actually use cultural and topical events to mold them to your brand. I think another great example of that is, think about Kanye's Super Bowl ad, right? So you're seeing a bunch of different ads, so on and so forth, blah blah blah. Now everybody knows Kanye took a pretty big hit after he lost, or after his breakup with Adidas. But the interesting thing was, now everybody has the framing of that in mind. Whether that's true or not is a completely different story. But everybody has that framing in mind now. And when you see Kanye um, in his car and he's driving and he's recording this video, and where he's saying, hey, I spent all the money on the Super Bowl ad placement, so we didn't have any money to shoot the ad, so just go on Yeezy.com and buy my stuff, and it gets sold out within a few hours. So that's an interesting way of how he's using the cultural framing of his own brand, of himself, and molding that to be unique, be different, while also being top. Another thing that a lot of creative branding people are going to talk about, and if I don't talk about it, I'm probably going to get a lot of hate, so I'm going to talk about it, is brand voice and tone. Now, a lot of these elements pretty much we have spoken about. There are two things to keep in mind, especially with brand voice and tone. It's not enough to define it, because the actual components within brand voice and tone are, well, essentially two things. It's personality and consistency. So your brand voice and tone, that means your visual language, your written language, your topical use of culture, events, so on and so forth, all of that leads into your brand tone and voice. And if that does not have a personality of its own, it's almost like your brand is a person, right? I think that's the easiest way to understand it. And what you're trying to do with your brand tone and voice is bring that person's characteristics to life. And also, the other element that's going to really land your brand tone and voice is the consistency of you using it. Now, what I see a lot of brands do is they'll have it nailed down on their website, they'll have it nailed down on their Twitter, so on and so forth. But the moment you go to Telegram or you go to their Discord server, it's a completely different picture. Now they're talking all like they're talking very differently to the personality that they created on Twitter. So it's an interesting thing to keep in mind is that it needs to be consistent across platforms, and it also needs to be consistent over a long period of time. Because when you think about Nike and you think about running shoes and you think about just do it, that's a tagline that has existed and remained consistent over multiple decades, right? And when you are when you think about brand voice and tone, if it doesn't have a personality of its own, Nike is equal to running, is equal to athletes, is equal to just do it. It's a consistent brand tone and voice that has a personality of its own. Like Nike is a brand for achievers. Nike is the brand for people who are extraordinary, so on and so forth. That's very consistent through their stores, the way their employees talk, the way they sell you their products. Apple is another great example of that. So have building a personality, giving certain characteristics to the person, which is your brand that you're building, and keeping that consistent across the board is extremely important. And finally, a couple of things that I want to talk about very quickly is going back to the community engagement part. So people are very quick to see through BS. And if you're trying to fake a brand, which is technically feasible and possible, and in most cases, the easier way out, if you're trying to do that, please don't do it. People see through your bullshit, and make sure that whenever it is that you are trying to build that sort of sense of community through your brand, that it feels natural. And let's say, for example, and this sort of goes back to the topical cultural resonance point that we spoke about, but if the market's bad, if your token is performing really bad, you can use that opportunity to be either completely serious or completely bonkers, right? So you can turn it into a funny incident. But if you're not genuine about it and you're trying to fake it, people are most likely going to see through that. So make sure that whenever it is that you're using brand with community engagement and, you know, driving up that sense of tribalness almost within your community, that you are being genuine about it. If you want to be serious, be serious. Sometimes things are going wrong, but if your brand has a completely different image and then you're trying to sound completely different in a time of crisis, not really going to work. So again, that goes back to the consistency point. If you are building a framing for yourself, if you are giving your brand a personality, characteristics, so on and so forth, make sure that follows through, and make sure that you're not trying to fake it. And the final thing is make it different, make it unique. And the two things that I want you to keep in mind is if you're building a brand, it's going to have a unique value proposition. You need to find out a way not to be pushy about your unique value proposition. And I think the really common example of that is we do X number of transactions within a second, blah, blah, blah. Nobody cares. What I care about is how is that going to help me. So the unique value proposition that you're building for your brand, the positioning that you have acquired within the market, if it does not go along with all of the other things we spoke about in the list, it's going to fall flat. So make sure that your unique value proposition and your competitive edge are expressed in a way that resonates with a user's actual pain point, and that is not selling them a superficial dream. So a bad example of unique value proposition is simply saying we are unique because we're giving you 10x the returns that you would get on any other product. Now, how you could make that interesting and really hit home, especially within your branding element, I think a great example of that was when I was at CoinSwitch. It's a centralized exchange. It's probably one of the most boring things you can do in crypto. No offense to anybody. But the way we made it interesting is we ran a whole campaign around people that were able to use CoinSwitch, earn a lot of money through crypto. But instead of the crypto bro narrative, we actually, and keeping the regional specifications in mind, we turned that into hey, this father was able to use CoinSwitch was able to make money, and now he can send his daughter to any college that she wants to go to, and we centered a campaign around that. So you see, the unique value proposition is still hey, you can make money easy, or you can make a lot of money, but it's framed in a way that feels very genuine, that feels very unique, feels like you are different than a lot of other people. So that was this week's episode. You're probably going to get another one this week because I didn't do it last week. But that was today's episode. I know a lot of you watch these episodes, but you don't follow me. So please do that. Turn on notifications. If you don't like seeing these very long videos, I also post a lot of shorts that are clips from these episodes, so you can tune into them. Please do follow me. Please do give me feedback if you actually like an episode, dislike an episode. I'm trying to do different things, trying to give you a lot more value. So I appreciate the love. I would love even more feedback and hope to see you in the next episode. GM, bye bye.